Hi, I'm Kristen. Today I'm going to tell you basically the story of a quilt that I made this week for my really good friend. She showed me basically an inspiration photo of what her living room was going to look like in her new home. And I kind of went from there. And it started one way and it turned out another way. But I basically, in the end, I used two Drunkard's dies, Accuquilt dies, on my Accuquilt cutter. You can use other templates. If you don't have that, don't worry. And I've talked about using Accuquilt in my quilts a lot just because I'm like allergic to cutting properly. But I've actually had these Drunkard's dies for a really long time. I haven't made anything with them because I have a bit of a fear of sewing with curves, which I think a lot of people have. But there were two videos on YouTube, which I'm going to tell you about from other channels, that kind of changed my mind and gave me a bit of confidence to try the sort of ideas that have been ruminating for ages. And I just was like, not yet. So hopefully if there's something like that, doesn't have to be Drunkard's Path, whatever, that you have been thinking you want to try and you've maybe got the tool or the template and you just haven't done it yet, maybe this will help you. So anyway, so how the whole thing started, basically my friend moved to a new house. It's a little bit away from here. It's about a 45-minute drive, so I don't see her as much as I used to, but I still see her. And it's like a bungalow, and it's a little bit dated for where we are. So I'm in the UK, so housing is just different than if you're in North America or where I came from in Canada. Anyway, so her living room is like almost like not quite an L or a V, but it's an odd shape. And then there's two great big picture windows that look out into the garden. So anyway, she had someone help her with like ideas for how to decorate it. And she showed me this inspiration photo. And so you can see the colors are very sort of neutral, green. She's trying, and like beiges and things. And she's trying to pull in the colors from the garden. So the idea is that the focus is on the garden, right? So she didn't want any great big bold bright colors like the ones I usually use. And so I told her I wanted to make a quilt for her basically for this room. And so she sent me that photo and was like, this is the colors, this is the kind of thing I would want. And then I also sent her some photos of quilts, like traditionally pieced ones, like I can't even remember which ones I sent, but they were ones with like traditional blocks with like maybe half square triangles and makes up a star and that kind of stuff. And then some improv ones and some other ones. Like I sent her a whole bunch of stuff and was like, can you just, it's not going to look like any of these quilts, but which ones are you drawn to, right? And so she said back, her and her husband looked at it and they liked the ones that were a bit more improv. Some of them, one of them had curves in it with improv in it, and a few of them didn't that she sent back, but it definitely was not your like, every block is the same kind of a quilt. So I was like, okay, that's fine. I can do that. No problem. So it's kind of what I was hoping she would say. But anyway, so I just started with a fabric pull. I pulled, frankly, a lot of fabrics that I have had on my shelf and I don't use because they're not my colors. So browns, beiges, creams, greens, and a little bit of black because she did say there was going to be some black, like a minimal amount of black in the design. So I wanted to put a tiny bit in there, but not too much. So anyway, so did this fabric pull. That sat around for a little bit. Then I was like, okay, whatever. I'm just gonna go at it. So some of them were scraps, some of them were bigger pieces. And so I just started doing what I like to call large scale crumb piecing. I think some people call it something called slab quilting or slab piecing or something, but it's basically you're taking a bunch of, so say you have a long strip, say a jelly roll strip or something, and you've got some smaller bits, you would just sew all those bits along and then snip, press, trim, and then you turn it around and sew something else to it. So it's not strictly any kind of order. It's not like definitely a log cabin or courthouse steps or anything like that. It's just sew one piece of fabric to another. So very improv, right? So I ended up with all of these blocks. I'll show you pictures that were okay. And I liked some of them and I didn't have a firm idea. I thought I was just going to like space them out or maybe cut them into strips or something like that. Anyway, so it was getting closer to Christmas and I still was not sure what I was going to do with it. And then as it turned out, we didn't find a date to meet up before Christmas. So I was like, okay, that's fine. I'll just put it on hold until I know I'm going to see her. And she was fine with that. She's not precious about when she gets stuff. Anyway, and then January, I was trying to make plans with her to meet up, and her auntie was in town for like a whole month. And I was like, oh, there you go. I'm good, because I've already arranged to do the sew along, which obviously some of you took part in. So I don't have time to do this. So anyway, so we didn't have a date to meet up. And then finally, we decided we were going to meet for lunch. So today is Monday. I'll put I don't remember what the date is today. 6th, the 5th of February, it doesn't matter. Anyway, yesterday we were going to meet up for lunch. So when I finished the sew along quilt the week before, I had ended up setting myself this rather quick deadline to get it quilted and bound in time for the Monday video. And I know I didn't have to do that, but I did it. And I really enjoyed having the deadline. It really made me work, I think, really well. It was fun. It was like being back in university when I used to do like the papers the night before and stuff like that. Anyway, so I was like, okay, so I've got a week. Let's set another mini deadline, and I'm going to give her the quilt on Sunday. So that's what I decided to do. But I still didn't know what I was going to do with it. And somewhere around there, when I was setting the deadline, I watched a video from Dave's Craft Room. This is my new favorite YouTube channel. He's really cool. He just does lots of really different quilts. His process sort of speaks to me, the way he works and stuff. And he's quite funny as well. Anyway, he did one that was like a drunkard's path using strip piecing. And he talks in the video about, he got it from a book by somebody else. I don't remember who, but I'll link to his video in the description anyway. And his quilt turned out really, really cool. Now I wasn't going to do the same thing that he did, but it kind of got me going, oh yeah, I remember seeing, so I have seen Drunkard's Path quilts in the past where people have used sort of this kind of improv crumb piecing or strips and things, and then they cut the Drunkard's Path shapes out of it. And so I was like, oh, I could do that with these slabs that I've already pieced. So I was like, okay, cool. So here's where I've got to. I've decided, as I said, my deadline is Sunday and it is Tuesday night. But what I'm doing right now is trying to get basically all of these sort of pieced slabs that I've made, or big crumb blocks, whatever you want to call it, and cutting out basically as many shapes as I can. So I've got these smaller Accuquilt dies that I think, what does it say on it? Make a 4-inch quarter block together. So that's the outer curve and the inner one. And I'll put the die numbers in the description of the video. And then I've also got a bigger one, but I found a really cool tip from Stephen Bland from the Idiot Quilter about how you can kind of size Drunkard's Path quilt blocks down, which is good for me given that the way I've been piecing the curves has not been totally spot on every time. So I'll show you some more of that later. And I'll also link to his video in the description where I got this really great golden nugget of a tip. But what I'm doing right now is, so cutting out these crumb slab block things, improv pieces into the Drunkard's Path shapes. So either the big one or the little ones. And also some of the other scraps that I pulled as part of my fabric pull. So some of these are not pieced, they're just solid. Well, not necessarily all solid, some of them have prints, but you know what I mean. I'm just cutting out bits as well, so I can mix and match the ones that are pieced with the ones that aren't. I still don't know what the layout's gonna be, that's fine, we're gonna deal with that later. But this is what I'm doing for right now. So my goal Tuesday night is to get a whole bunch of these cuts, like just get loads cut. I don't know how big, I have a rough idea how big I want the quilt to be. I don't know if this will be too little or too much, but I'm gonna try and get all this stuff cut, and then hopefully tomorrow piecing and maybe trimming. We'll see how far we get with that in terms of the quarter blocks of the, I keep wanting to call it a Dresden plate of the Drunkard's Path. And then I'll start putting them together and seeing where I get to. So, and I've got a little system here. So I've got the stuff I'm cutting on this side. I'm on the floor, it's just easier. My go cutter's over here. And then behind me, I've got the bigger what do you call that? The outer curve of the Drunkard's path and the inner one. So these are kind of my outputs of the cutting. And then I've got the little ones as well, also behind me. And then I have a box for, so once I've, you know, cut some stuff out and I maybe can't get any more shapes out of it, so I've got something like this, then what I'm doing is taking my fabric scissors and just trimming off the bits that are too thin for me to sew through. And then I have a pile of trimmings, which will go in my big thread catcher laundry basket bin, and it'll become stuffing one day. And then something like this, once I cut it, which is more like a strip, that's gonna go in a box over behind me, which is for strips. And it might end up in this quilt somehow, because if I find I don't have enough pieces, I'll just, you know, I'll start piecing these bits together to make another slab crumb block thing. And then I can cut the shape out of that again, right? So we still have more stuff to work with. So anyway, so I'm sorting that way. And then I've got another, just popping crumbs, things that are a bit smaller than a strip, into the top of a box for the moment. And they might end up in the quilt as well. And if not, then I can easily put them in one of my crumb drawers, and that'll just be easier than having a whole big mess all over the floor. So that's my kind of cutting system for tonight. So I did get quite a few pieces cut. I did get the cutting all done on the Tuesday night. There are guidance about, you know, how you should put the fabric into the Accuquilt cutter in terms of keeping it on the straight of grain or the bias or whichever one you're supposed to be putting it on. I don't pay attention to that. You probably should if you're doing something accurate, but because I'm doing an improv quilt and I'm going to quilt it rather densely, I'm just getting the shapes out. That's all I'm doing. I'm just putting the scraps on and getting the shapes out. And we're not worrying about any of the rest of that. But obviously you do you with that. Okay, so here's where I've got to. I've got about, I think, I've counted and made sure that I've got pairs of each size. That's all. So I've got 25, I think it was, of these bigger pairs. Oh, I can't even see this. Sorry. 25 of these bigger pairs, and I've kind of roughly separated them out into sort of like a solid fabric, or, and I mean solid as in not pieced. I know that's a print. Or like a crumb, whatever you want to call this, improv-y thing, right? And they're not necessarily equal numbers or whatever, but just so that when I'm putting them together, I can more easily mix and match. So I've got 25 pairs of this big one, which is supposed to make something like an 8-inch quarter block, but I'm probably going to trim those down because I probably won't sew them correctly. And then, let me move this. And then I've got, I think it was more like 36 of these smaller pairs that I think make a 4-inch quarter block. And again, it doesn't matter because I'm probably going to trim them. So that's what I'm going to start with. And I'm basically just going to sew curves and try and teach myself how to do it. I've tried a few and they've gone okay, but I've had some issues. So I'm just thinking by the time I'm finished all of this, I'll be that much better. So that's the plan. And I haven't cut this many because I've like calculated that this is going to make X size of a quilt or anything like that. I just felt like I was done, and they made pairs. And then I've still got all these crumbs over here. So if I want to piece another crumb block or whatever, and I've got another box somewhere of some other fabrics from the fabric pull that I haven't used, which I could add, you know, sorry, I'm moving this camera around too much. Anyway, so I'm going to set my camera up by the sewing machine and show you me piecing the curves. Please remember, I am just learning myself. So this is not a definitive guide to how to sew a curve. I'm just going to show you what I'm doing, and you can choose to try it yourself or critique it or just watch. Cool. Now there are, of course, all sorts of tutorials out there that you can find on sewing a drunkard's path where you pin the curve all the way around. But the whole point of me buying the Accuquilt Dies was for these little register marks. You see the little pokey triangles in the middle of both of the pieces. You're supposed to try and match those up. So I'm trying this method where you just sort of sew around really slowly, and you're slowly getting the curves to meet. It looks a bit funny at the beginning because their pieces are heading in the opposite direction to each other, but as you sew, it kind of comes together, and so it meets at that register point. I seem to struggle with this second half. The first half's usually okay-ish. The second half, I find it a bit hard to get the very end to meet properly. So I'm not sure exactly what I'm doing wrong there, but it's like it was good enough for what I was going to do to trim it later, basically. And there was no way I was going to use like if I had to pin, you know, I sometimes you see them using like 6, 8, 10 pins in these things. That if I had to pin each one of these before I sewed it, there's no way I would be meeting my Sunday deadline. So, and this is the way like if I'm ever going to sew curves again, I want to be able to just grab the piece and do it. So this is the way I've seen people do it that I want to learn how to do. So I thought, well, fine, I've got whatever, 36 small ones and 25 big pairs. And by the time I'm finished that, I'm just going to feel a little bit more confident with doing it. And the trimming technique that I used after this also added to that, because I knew it wasn't like high stakes whether or not it meets at the end, because I can trim it off. So that really did help me to just go, right, let's just go for it. So this is how I sewed them all. I found the smaller ones slightly easier than the bigger ones, which doesn't, usually I would have thought bigger would have been easier, but I had more of like ends overshooting. I'll show you when I'm pressing it. But I had more of the ends kind of overshooting when it came to the larger Dresden. Why do I keep calling them Dresden? Larger Drunkard's Bath quarter blocks. Anyway, it's the D's. I can't get that out of my head. Anyway, I'll just speed this up so that you can just see a little bit more of it. But this is how I went about doing it. But again, I'm not a teacher of sewing curves. In terms of which fabrics I was putting together in the quarter blocks, I was trying not to have too many crumbs with crumbs. So like the outer curve of the Drunkard's Path is like a crumb slab block cut out, and the other one isn't. So I was trying to do that mostly, but I did have a few where it was like crumbs with crumbs, and quite a few where it was like a solid or a plain piece of fabric with another one. And I wasn't always necessarily trying to contrast and having like dark with light or anything like that. It was a big mix, and I wasn't thinking about it too much. But, you know, if I saw a pairing that I didn't like, I would just switch it out for the next one in the pile or something like that. So next I'm going to tell you about finding that trimming tip that made me confident to just go ahead and sew these. So I ended up watching a video by Stephen Bland. His channel is The Idiot Quilter. And I've sort of met him before online. He's interviewed me on his channel. And so I watched his, and he had a different way of sewing than I wanted to do. It's not a million miles away, but a little bit different. But he had a really great golden nugget about how to trim them. So I think he was talking about just having little discrepancies when you finish the curve, and there's just a little bit that's different at the bottom, whereas some of mine had big, like, it was really off. But because it's an improv quilt, it doesn't matter what size my Drunkard's Path blocks turned out. You know, the way you sew them is in quarter blocks. So all I want is for them to match and make a hole, and for the points to match. But I just need to be able to trim them all to the same size. So 4 to the same size, essentially, right? But I didn't know how to do it. So anyway, in his video, he had this really cool tip about using like a square ruler to find right angles. So the same line meets the curve on your Drunkard's Path both ways, and then you see how big of a square you can cut out of it. I will link to his video below because I'm sure he describes it better than I do. But anyway, that sort of freed me up to just go at sewing the curves and just use this as a practice exercise. And it doesn't matter if they didn't end up meeting at the end, because I was going to trim them all down. So that's what I did. So it was hard to see when I was sewing the little ones, because I found them a little bit easier. But the bigger ones, you can see here where I'm pressing, some of them have that outer curve kind of overshoots the inner one. So potentially maybe I'm stretching the outer curve when I'm sewing it. I'm not sure what's going on there. But anyway, that's why I needed Stephen's trimming tip. And so this is just me pressing. I tend to press the seam towards the outer curve. It's convex or concave. I don't know which one, so I'm not going to use that term. But you can kind of see how I'm pressing it there. And this is me using Stephen's cool right angle tip. So I've got a square ruler that's got all those lines on it. They didn't all need trimmed, but most of them did. And and I'm trying to find the right angles and then see what size I can make. So I kind of found the one that was sort of the common denominator for most of the blocks and was able to cut. I think I was able to get an 8-inch unfinished quarter block out of most of them. And I think it's meant to be 8.5. But anyways, but then for some of them, I did have to trim it smaller. So I would just put them in different piles if they ended up having to be trimmed smaller. And I would just join those ones together because they could be a block together as long as there were 3 or 4 of them. That was fine, right? It was just I needed to make sure I knew which ones were the same size. So I just had different piles going on the table. So most of the larger ones ended up 8-inch unfinished, and most of the smaller ones ended up 4-inch unfinished. And I think they were both supposed to be a 1/2 inch bigger, but whatever. And the way Stephen has described it in his video, you can kind of use any large size Accuquilt die to get a smaller size than that. So he again, look at the link in the description because he does explain it better than I'm doing it. But I found this really useful. And it just helps keep everything in proportion. That's why we're doing it. So because if you just trimmed it without looking at the right angle thing, then the curve would be off when you line it up with another block. So your points wouldn't match in the circle, if you see what I'm saying. So that's why it's such a good tip. Anyway, so I went and did all of those. I think I got all my trimming done on the Wednesday, I think. And then I started sewing everything together, I believe, on the Thursday. Once everything was trimmed, I just started pairing them up into, halves of a block and then into whole blocks. And I was just sewing them. You're probably supposed to nest the seams, but I had them both going in the same direction to try and get my points meet. I'm not sure if that's right, but it worked for me. There was a few, where I didn't have enough to make a full circle. And so I would leave them in halves and then try and join them with something else later. I think I put 4 little ones in the quarter of a big one at one point. Anyway, you'll see it when I get to the final layout. And then I just started laying out all the blocks to see where I was. So this is how many I got to after that kind of sewing. But obviously that is not looking big enough to make a quilt because I wanted it to be like throw size for a sofa. So I still didn't know what I wanted to do necessarily with the layout. This wasn't the layout necessarily. But I just started sewing blocks together, adding strips. So you can see there's some beige light colored strips coming into it at this point. And then just kept adding sections, kept adding strips and other bits of fabric to space things out. And this was all just kind of happening slowly over time. It went into the night. My son came down to see me. And eventually I had a quilt top, which I was ready to quilt. And I think I got to this point by Friday. I think this was Friday afternoon-ish. It ended up being 63 by 68 or 69 inch, something like that. So just like a good sofa quilt, which is what it was supposed to be. So I used fleece backing, sort of tawny brown, I don't know what color, backing, and polyester batting that I've never used before. I wanted to try it because the website where I bought it from here in the UK called it Canadian polyester and said it was warm, so I thought I would use that. And I just did straight line quilting on the Moxie with the channel locks. I did do a few lines of different colored threads, like the browns and the greens, but mostly it was like a cream kind of a color. So it was just really pretty close quilting because there were all those little crumbs and pieces inside the Drunkard's Path blocks, and I just wanted to make sure everything was kind of quilted down well. And also it does give it, that kind of matchsticky quilting does give it a bit of a modern look, which I think is what she was going for in her room. Anyway, I did get it all binded, all done. I didn't wash it, so I had to give her washing instructions for the first wash. I normally wash before I give my quilts, but anyway. So I gave it to her yesterday. She was super pleased, and she was showing me some more photos of progress in the room, and I do think it's going to go really well in her space. So, and I had a moment of kind of panic on this Saturday night that I wasn't going to get it bound in time and stuff, but eventually I did. So I actually still think I really like these mini deadlines for myself. Now, that's not something everybody needs. Obviously, deadlines for some people cause immense stress and procrastination. For me, I think they work, especially, so I work from home. I'm self-employed. I've got my blogs, I've got the channel, and I've got another little baby gifts business, all of which I'm the boss, and I could decide when I'm going to work and what I'm going to do. So that can be hard to motivate sometimes to get something done. So I'm liking this kind of, I need to get this done by a certain time. It has to be like for something that makes sense. I don't think I can do it every week. So having the 4th video of the sew along made sense. Having this time when I'm meeting her, when I actually haven't seen her for like 2 months, so I don't know when I'm going to see her again. That made sense as a mini deadline. So I'm going to try and work that into my kind of quilting and a bit my work life as well, just to kind of get things moving. So I don't know if that would work for any of you, but I found it really helpful these last couple weeks. The other thing about setting a deadline like that, if you can buy into the deadline, obviously, sometimes it's hard to go that deadline's really important because even that one, I know my friend wouldn't be upset if I didn't give her the quilt that day. But anyway, but if you can kind of in your head decide that deadline's important enough, then what it can also do is give you less space for dithering and so you just have to make choices. So you just have to go, okay, I'm just going to cut them into Drunkard's path shapes. Okay, I'm just going to trim them like this. I'm just going to sew them together. That's fine. And you just have to do it. And often that's when kind of you get the best stuff out, I find anyway. The quicker I make decisions, the better they tend to turn out. I know that's not the common wisdom, but when I sit there and stew and think, is this the right thing? Is this the right color? Is this the right whatever? It just gets all garbled and overthought. So I find having this kind of process where you really don't have that much time to think about it and you just get on and do it can sometimes yield better results. Now, different personality types, that's going to be different. But if that sounds a bit like you, then it might be something to try. Because it's one of those things, like when you're doing an improv quilt, right, you need to do something like limit the colors or limit the technique or something. Otherwise, it's just everything, right? So and putting those limits on what you're going to do kind of makes it easier to be creative in that space. So time can be one of those limits as well. Anyway, so I found it really helpful and I'm really happy with the quilt. There's always little bits of things. I can see where the batting kind of puckered a little bit in the middle despite it being on the long arm, but it's not that noticeable. And I've got to be easy on myself about that. So I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And I think she did genuinely like it. So I hope you enjoyed that little quilt story. And if you like videos like this, please don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. And I hope to see you again next time. Thanks so much for spending time with me. Bye.